Good day, everyone. The American Society of Safety Engineers is pleased to present this virtual classroom session entitled 90 Minutes to Safety Culture Excellence. My name is Jill, and I will be your moderator for this session. Please note that today's call is being recorded, and all participant lines will be muted during this broadcast. If you need assistance at any time today, please email us at ASSEvirtualclassroom@compartners.com. This session will last 90 minutes and include a specific question and answer period. However, feel free to pose a chat question at any time during today's presentation. You may enter a question simply by typing your question into the chat box on the lower left side of your screen and then click on the send button. These instructions will be repeated later in the program. At this point, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Shawn Galloway. Shawn Galloway is the President and Chief Operating Officer of ProAct Safety. As a professional keynote speaker and internationally recognized safety excellence expert, he has helped hundreds of organizations within every major industry achieve and sustain excellence in performance and culture. Shawn is also the host of the highly acclaimed weekly podcast series, Safety Culture Excellence. He is a columnist for several magazines and co-author of Steps to Safety Culture Excellence. Shawn has personally worked with the National Institutes of Health, MD Anderson, Merck, Bristol-Myers Squibb, Amway, Wrigley, Herman Miller, Eastman Chemical, Georgia Pacific, Honda, Ingersoll Rand, International Paper, Rockwell Automation, Timken, Starbucks, the United States Capitol, the United States Armed Forces, and over 100 similar organizations. His speaking and consulting engagements have taken him throughout North America, Europe, the UK, the Middle East, and Australia. ISHN magazine listed him in the 2012 Power 101 Leaders of the EHS World. Canadian Occupational Safety magazine refers to Shawn as a safety excellent coach. And Industry Week magazine writes, he helps organizations achieve safety excellence. Shawn has published over 250 podcasts, 80 articles, and 30 videos on the subject of safety excellence in culture and performance. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Shawn Galloway. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, and greetings, everyone. A pleasure to be here with you today. The American inventor Daniel Hillis once said that there are two ways to build complex things, engineering and evolution. Every organization has a culture. When Terry and I set about writing the book that was published by Wally that was already referenced, Steps to Safety Culture Excellence, we read everything that was previously published on the subject of safety culture. And one of the things they all agree with, and we do as well, is that there is no such thing as a standalone safety culture. Safety culture is a part of the occupational, the corporate culture. And some of the problems start coming about when we try to manage it separately. When I see cultural issues in safety within corporations or improvement opportunities, 9 times out of 10, I also see those same cultural issues in quality and on-time performance and productivity. So usually is it a standalone managed thing. Another thing that tends to happen is when the safety department tends to manage the safety culture, it sends the message that the safety department is responsible for the safety culture rather than the business leaders. What I want to share with you today are some better practices that some of our best performing clients have deployed and the way that they think about trying to improve their performance and culture. And what I hope that you'll see is that the models, some of the methodologies, and again, these better practices don't just apply to safety, they apply to all areas of operational performance. But notice I also use the term better practices. Many corporations are starting to change that terminology, and let's call it what it is. It's just terminology. But when we go out and we look for best practices, sometimes we'll adopt that best practice and we stop looking for a better way. There's always a better way to do things. Consider the way that we thought about things 10 years ago in safety, 20 years ago. It wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things that we used to plan for the number of fatalities per floor of a building that we were constructing. We've certainly got away from that thinking, but it really wasn't that long ago that nobody would drive and text. Now we have everybody driving and texting. And that's a huge problem that hopefully we're going to overcome in the short term. But we evolve in our capabilities by continuously looking and challenging the status quo thinking and saying that there has to be a better way. So my goal here today is not to provide a framework that says this is the way you should implement to achieve cultural excellence and safety. My goal is to provide you some practices and share with you some thinking that other corporations have deployed that have helped them achieve improvement areas, not just in their performance, but also their culture. And the culture, as we know, the layman definition is the way we do things around here, but it's also why we do what we do. It's a matter of not just characteristics, but also capabilities. And this is the thing. When we go out and look for what are the different characteristics and we try to model ourselves and within our corporation or our site against other characteristics, sometimes we forget about the capability side. Terry and I, my business partner, the founder of our firm, we like to joke that both of us are about 5'8", and we can't jump that high, so neither one of us are going to play for the NBA. We don't have that capability. We don't have some of those characteristics. So it's important that we look for what are all the things that other organizations do, but what are the things that we can do well? How can we do those things better? It can be quite demotivational from a cultural enhancement perspective to compare yourself against another company and say, how can we be more like them? The challenge is you won't. Every company has a different culture and subcultures and elements within those cultures. Yes, we want to understand where we are, but it's also important to understand how do we get better. And this is part of what I want to share with you is organizations need strategy to improve the culture. And when we deploy strategies in safety, sometimes we tend to go about it in the wrong way. For example, zero incidents is not a strategy. Implementing a program, being world-class in safety is not a strategy. But what I tend to see in a lot of really well-intending organizations is they tend to deploy their own strategy. It's what I refer to as the perpetual cycle of avoiding failure. See if you found yourself doing this before. You review the incident rate. You set a new incident rate goal. You develop a list of initiatives, then you execute those initiatives. Then you look at your incident rate. Did we make a difference? Marshall Goldsmith, in his book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, pointed out something that's called the success delusion. I'm successful. I behave this way. Therefore, I'm successful because of the way I behaved. Not necessarily. Sometimes we just got lucky. Sometimes it's Hawthorne effect because we're shining a spotlight or a level of activity is increased. Sometimes it's normal variation. This is the challenge that we know that we're all trying to get past, and that's that just measuring ourselves against lagging indicators. But if you think about what a real strategy is, it's a framework within which decisions are made to prioritize our goals, objectives, and then our initiatives. I live in the Woodlands, Texas. Consider wherever you're calling in or listening to this recorded webinar after today's live event, consider you want to get to where you're at, to my home in the Woodlands. How are we going to get there? What are the different roads we're going to take? What's the modes of transportation we're going to take? Multiple sometimes. How are we going to measure that we're going in the right direction, not just did we land at Shawn's house? Now, as we set about on this journey, there's all kinds of roadblocks. There's going to be holes in the road. Unfortunately, the state of Washington experienced a bridge that collapsed not too long ago. Now, if those bridges and those holes have nothing to do with our journey, we can spend a lot of time and energy focusing on the wrong thing to try to improve safety because we don't have a proactive prioritization process to ensure that our time and energy are being spent on the right things and can demonstrate when we focus on those things that we're executing against a strategy. This is the big challenge that a lot of our clients have found themselves in, is that when site by site or smaller corporations can much easier obtain that zero injury, that becomes a great place to be, but it's not a continuous improvement objective or goal. If zero is your measurement of improvement, what happens when you get there? And the other challenge is if we get zero injuries and we can't precisely articulate to somebody why we have those zero injuries, what's our sense of confidence that we're going to be able to repeat it year after year? And that's why a lot of companies are starting to evolve all of their practices and initiatives to not just focusing on the injury prevention side of safety, but also focus on the cultural side of safety. I love what Sir Winston Churchill said. He said, first we shape our dwellings, and then our dwellings shape us. Every organization, as I've already said, has an existing culture and safety beliefs and behaviors within those cultures. Now, when somebody joins that organization, they're normed by the way people think. And sometimes outside people can influence that as well. But it's important that we have a strategy, because failing less is certainly not a strategy. Plus, as you've heard me probably say, and a lot of other speakers and leaders in our industry, we've said for years that if zero injuries equals excellence and safety, people start to internalize, well, if safety excellence means not getting hurt, then anything that I do that doesn't get me hurt must be safe, and that's certainly flawed logic. Now, of course, we don't want anybody getting injured, but we have to start thinking beyond this and saying, within our culture, if we are to visit one of our locations or even another site that we want to try to start our benchmarking and better practices visits, what would we see taking place? What would we hear within the communication that gives us a sense of confidence in why they have those results? That's that end-in-mind thinking that the late Stephen Covey talked about. And this is what we strongly encourage companies to look at, is develop their strategy for cultural improvement first before starting to do a culture assessment to see how we can improve. Because the latter tends to be more of an exercise in closing gaps rather than an exercise in ensuring the gaps we close are the ones that help us demonstrate that we're executing against our strategy. And this helps to address a lot of that program of the month thinking, because a lot of times people can't see how these initiatives roll up into our overall plan of trying to achieve cultural excellence. But we all know we have those elements, and what a lot of people have written about and said, you know, what people do when nobody's looking is an element of the culture. What you do when nobody's looking is a reflection of your own values and everything. I took this picture after landing at an international flight in Houston, where I live outside of. Apologize, I should have said that earlier. The Woodlands is located about 30 miles north of Houston. But I landed at Houston Airport. I took this picture a couple of years ago. And yes, I did say something to this individual, for those of you curious about that. But I have a pass that allows me to get through customs pretty quickly, and I was one of the first ones through. It was very early in the morning after an international flight, and I came downstairs, and this is what I saw. Now, as you can see there, he's laying from a safety perspective on a whole series of pinch points. Now, I would argue that this individual might have a false sense of security about that system there, because I've seen those devices start turning before the bell is supposed to go off in advance of it. But he's also laying in what a lot of people refer to as the line of fire, because that's right where the baggage, the luggage, comes down. Now, this is just a reflection of what people do when nobody's looking, and this is something that we want to make sure that we're, as leaders, that we are providing people the right ideas, the right type of thinking, so it affects what they do at 2 o'clock in the morning when they're working by themselves or working just with fellow employees. And what we're all trying to get towards in this level of cultural excellence and safety and quality and productivity and a lot of others is that level of discretionary effort. And where a lot of business models were built on after the industrial and the technological revolutions, it was built on more of a command and control model. And we're all familiar with that. You go out and tell people what to do, edicts from a level of authority, you're going to move hands and feet. You might end up even actually getting some of the required effort. But you're also going to usually end up with only the minimal effort necessary and people just behaving in a way that's avoiding any negative consequences. A very frequently cited example here is, I know none of you listening into this session here would speed, because none of us speed, right? So if we happen to be driving with somebody that is speeding and they see law enforcement on the side of the road, what might they do? They might slow down. Now, what might they do after they pass the law enforcement? They may pick their speed back up. That's one example of it. But a lot of times we tend to control that behavior by then punishing. So what would happen if somebody gets pulled over and issued a citation for speeding? Does that shape their decision to never speed again? No. Typically that prompts somebody to go to the local electronics store and purchase a radar detector, thus getting better at not getting caught. We don't want people in our culture working hard to not get caught or working hard to avoid safety. Let me elaborate a little bit more of the story here. I was assessing the site of a very large corporation, one of their locations that had about 1,100 people. From a total recordable incident rate, the number of incidents per 200,000 work hours, recordable incidents, we were looking at it, and they were below a 1 frequency rate. So from a lagging indicator perspective, they're pretty good. So they've been below a 1 frequency rate for several years, and they just couldn't get past that. Well, leadership came to the conclusion that perhaps it's the culture that's become that roadblock. So they asked me to come in, and I'm interviewing hundreds of people from this location. And in one of my first sessions with hourly employees, just hourly employees, I'm never going to forget what this one lady said to me, and it stuck with me for several years now. She said exactly this: in a few weeks, I'm going to retire after 30 years here. The only time they've ever talked to me about safety is when I've done something wrong. Just once before I retire, I wish they'd tell me when I've done something right. Think about that. What was unfortunate is this wasn't just representative of how feedback and safety occurred. This is representative of how feedback in any level of performance occurred. So trying to address from a cultural perspective the way leaders give feedback and people talk to one another about safety would have very limited impact if this wasn't a part of the business objective to improve the overall cultural capabilities of leaders to talk to one another. This is why I'm encouraging, a lot of us use the term safety culture to give a sense of identity, so it's something that appears to be a little bit more manageable. But it can be something that will put you in the wrong direction if we're not looking at this and saying, do we have the right strategy to ensure we're not just affecting the safety element of the culture, but the overall business culture? And a lot of the reasons that we fail to tap into the hearts and minds and getting people to want to do more in that discretionary effort is because we don't give people that sense of involvement. Deming said it best many years ago: people support what they help to create. If people don't understand the rationale, I like to quote John Cotter's research out of Harvard Business School, and he's published a lot of books, worked with a lot of great corporations, and according to his research, he found that there are three primary things that might influence somebody to resist change. And change is what we're talking about: changing, evolving the culture, enhancing it. Number one reason why he said it may cause somebody to resist is if they don't understand the change. Think about how well do we really communicate in safety? Do we give people a sense of ownership and why we're doing what we're doing? The other thing Cotter points out, which is going to be relevant to the next two, is people respond emotionally to change before they respond logically to change. We tend to give people the organizational rationale rather than answering that what's in it for me question for them personally, realizing that, in North America and a lot of other developed countries as well, you're more likely to get injured outside of work than at work. So do we really answer that what's in it for me questions where they can see that value proposition, how it fits in with what we're trying to accomplish as an organization? The number two reason, according to Cotter, is that people don't like the change. Again, that's an emotional response. The number three reason, they don't like the person bringing the change. So when we're trying to evolve culture, when we're trying to enhance the way people think and what they do within the safety elements of the culture, do we have people that are really leading and inspiring people, or is it more of a policing approach in safety and only giving feedback when people aren't doing what we want them to do? If we want to capture the hearts and minds and address that level of discretionary effort, we have to make sure people understand and have a sense of identity and purpose in what we're trying to accomplish. Ford Motor Company is a great organization. However, it's funny, how a lot of this was first built, and this was indicative of a lot of companies at that time. Henry Ford was quoted as saying in the early 1900s, "Why is it every time I ask for a pair of hands, a brain comes attached?" That's where that kind of term, hang your brain at the door and do as you're told, kind of came from. We don't want people to just stand on an assembly line and follow instructions. We want to have an engaged workforce. But going out and saying, "Proof you're empowered," doesn't result in an empowered workforce. We need a strategy to ensure that we can obtain that. Now, if you think about how a lot of corporations tend to dominate market share, whether that's a politically correct term or not, most private enterprises want to capture as much of the market share as possible to where they can be an industry leader. So if businesses think from a business planning perspective how to capture, dominate, own as much market share as possible, there's a lot of thought, a lot of processes that are put in place. Is there really any different in safety? How I tend to look at it when Terry and I were first putting the stuff together to articulate it in the book, corporations want to own as much of the market share as possible. Well, in safety, we too want to own the market share, but the market share here is the employee's attention share. And the employees are anyone, all the customers of safety, managers, contractors, employees, temporary, our customers, business customers. What are we doing to really capture their attention share? If we have somebody's attention for 30 minutes in safety, what do they walk away with remembering? There's actually a measurement there called return on attention. But if I have your attention for this 90-minute webinar, you're going to remember more of the pictures and stories than any facts and figures that I share. I know that, and that's how communication tends to work. But how are we dominating attention share in safety? What are we doing to really market people in safety? And I'll talk about that a little bit. We actually do need to market people. Some people say you shouldn't have to sell others on safety. Well, you do if you want people to do more than what's required to collect a paycheck. All employment is a behavioral rental agreement. We rent people's behavior, and if they fail to give us the behavior that's required, their job may be in jeopardy. So if people don't do the mandatory compliance rules, policies, and procedures, yeah, those are things we shouldn't necessarily have to market. But if we want people to be inspired to want to do more, to receive safety magazines at home as an employee to read them and bring new ideas in, that's something you need to market people to. Now, a lot of times the things that we do, listening to the voice of the customer and everything to try to improve safety, we tend to come up with some off-the-wall ideas. Hopefully you can see this picture here. Stop struggling with those stubborn plastic packages. You could purchase this device that's in a plastic package. We tend to do a lot of things to try to improve safety, and from one perspective, we should keep it fresh. We should be looking for new things. I love what Peter Drucker said. He said, there's nothing so useless as doing efficiently that which should not be done at all. We tend to spend a lot of time and energy to improve safety, but to what end? What aspect of safety are we trying to improve? Henry Ford was also quoted as saying, if I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. Sometimes we need to inspire and we need to give people new ways of thinking. Maybe they don't know what excellence looks like in safety, and that's the role that a safety professional should be, not the doer of safety, but more the thought leader within an organization. And that's also why the strategy that we're talking about here should not be set by the safety department. They should be advisors to the strategy that's managed and executed by the business leaders within the organization, just as they're managing all other elements of safety. Yes, we want safety to become a core value in the organization, but I think we need to start thinking beyond that as well, because companies also want trust to be a core value and honesty, integrity to be a core value. Yet where's our manager of trust? Where's our manager of integrity? Now, I know safety is a lot more complicated than that, but when we say that we want to have safety as a core value, it can't be delegated to another department. If a value is delegated to another department, it's never going to be integral to the way we do things around here. And that's why this needs to be an element of business strategy, not something that's managed by a separate department. So this is one framework, just an example, and in several slides from now I'll show you another example about how our organizations look at this. But you need to have a roadmap, you need to have a plan, you need to have a strategic framework that helps you proactively prioritize what initiatives we need to focus on. So we could demonstrate to others those initiatives help us accomplish our key objectives, which will help us meet our goals and ensure that we're getting closer to our vision of what safety excellence looks like. And again, as you've already heard me say, zero injuries is not just by itself safety excellence. It's the things that we do to create zero injuries and how well aligned and how consistent those things are. Knowing also that we're still going to get injured or we're still going to have exposure to risk at some point. And that's setting that right expectation that while we can achieve zero injuries, right now at the time of this recording, we don't have all the devices and all the systems out there to control all possible risk exposure. So that's also part of this, is maintaining a healthy degree of vulnerability that it could happen to us. Even if we have great results, there's still going to be risk out there. And that goes back to the challenging status quo and best practices that there always is a better way. But we do need to look at what are our core values, even within safety. What are the key beliefs you want people to have? And that's different than situational. Sometimes safety first can be a situational value, not necessarily a core value in some settings. But what is our vision? What would you see when you visit one of your locations that lets you know why you have the results that are excellent in safety? Now you can start prioritizing these things and identifying how you're going to market it, how you're going to hold people accountable, who within the organization can be the best leaders to deploy this change, because culture change happens best from within, not led by an outside expert like myself or an outside facilitator. That's the same thing in safety. The safety department cannot be the ones leading the safety culture improvement. It has to be the business leaders. Otherwise, it's not going to be sustainable. But then as we're about to go out there, we can identify our measurements and how we can make those adjustments. When I served in the Army, they taught me that all strategies are successful until they reach the enemy, because the enemy hasn't voted yet. Mike Tyson, the other philosopher, if you will, had a different saying. He said that everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. That's a different way of saying it, but we have to develop our plan realizing that plans are going to change. But we don't want to just change and adjust our plans when we're looking at the end of the year to say, how did we do? That's why we need measurements of progress. We need measurements of improvement, which is a little bit different than measurements of activities. Leading indicators as a measurement of activities tells you if you're doing things, but that still can put you in that success delusion that you're doing a bunch of things, you're doing a bunch of observations, audits, housekeeping inspections, and we're getting good results. Therefore, it's because we're doing these things. Well, what's the improvement from those activities that lets you know why you're getting the results that you want? So another model I'd like to share with you is something that Terry and I have used for several years to kind of paint the picture of where a lot of corporations are going. If you look at your current performance and your desire to get to this sustainable level of excellence, and that's that continuous improvement thinking, even if you have great results year after year. Well, what a lot of companies first have to do is they have to focus on the basics. Management's first responsibility is compliance. If you're not doing the basics, the rules, the regulations, PPE, policies, the things that we know cover high severity, high probability events, you have to put those things in place. But realize it's only going to get you partially across. You should have rules in place. When we worked at the U.S. Navy several years ago, we overheard a saying there that all rules are written in blood. Now, I apologize for the vulgarness of that statement there, but there's a lot of truth to that. We have those rules because it covers the high probability, the high severity stuff I just mentioned. But we also need to enforce these rules. Enforcing is not just saying something to an employee when they're not wearing the PPE. It's saying something when they are. Enforcement's not just about negative consequences and negative feedback. But the question Terry and I have been asking for many years of a lot of companies, and you'll probably have the same answer to this: can you obey all the rules, follow all the procedures, wear all your personal protective equipment, and still get injured? The answer is always yes. There's still risk exposure out there, and that's where a lot of companies have started to focus by involving the workforce in the area that they can help us most influence, and that's the culture. Now, to close this out, you need to have a focus, and you need to look at how we can make this reinforced from within. Focus to us is an acronym which stands for Forming One Common Understanding of Safety. What do we all think about? What's the language that we use? How clear are the terminology? In your organization, what is a near miss? How would you define a near miss? OSHA has a definition for near misses, but most companies have about 6 or 7 different definitions across their assets or their locations on what a near miss is. So even as something as basic as what is safe? What is safety? How would you define safety? If safe in the organization is defined as not getting hurt, then again, that tends to perpetuate anything that I do that doesn't get me hurt must be safe. So there needs to be clarity within the organization. Sometimes it's as simple as clarity around certain terminology. But once we develop from a cultural perspective what we can do above and beyond the rules, policies, and procedures, and I'm not just talking about injury prevention, but I'm also talking about what would we like people to do and what can we help them focus on that helps us enhance our culture. Now, how do we establish that? What are the systems, tools we use to help ensure that those things are reinforced at 2 in the morning when no one's around? Now, where a lot of companies are realizing is that old definition of management, getting things done through other people. Well, the accepted statement more around leadership is inspiring people to do more than what's possible when nobody's looking. And that's truly what leadership's about. So how do we inspire people to do more? And a lot of companies will have sayings like, safety is a condition of employment. And I've already talked about that, but yes, not doing the things that are required by regulation, by company policy, yes, we have to do those things. But we also want people to do more than just what's required. And how are we establishing trust? Trust is the glue that really holds an organization together. It's the glue of another model that I'll show you later on as well. But how well are we establishing trust? Do people trust one another? Do they trust the intentions and the direction being given by the leaders? And how well are we establishing teamwork within the organization? If you have a team together and there's politics on that team, or there's winners and there's losers, that's more of a committee, not a team. I worked with somebody many years ago that had a great little saying that he shared with me. He said, teamwork means we're not going to allow each other to fail regardless of who we are. I think that's a nice, simple description about what teamwork really is all about. Whether you're a senior executive, you're a temporary employee, a contractor, a customer, we're all in this together. How well are we focusing on the right things? Now, we're not going to get away from this. We still have to manage our failure rates, but managing the failure rate doesn't tell us how to get better. Now, if you have a tremendous amount of incidents, then yes, of course, you're going to be focusing on failure avoidance. But when the goal is just to fail less, think about what that does from a cultural perspective. All right, it's halfway through the year. I want you to work really hard to fail less than the first part of this year. It's like sending a team out on the field to not screw up. We want people to be motivated by accomplishing something, not just by reducing our failures. We don't want people working hard to not do things and avoid things. Think about that lady's comment to me in the culture assessment. That's why we need to start looking at how we can influence performance. I apologize, some of the graphics didn't carry over in the translation here into the webinar. But we need to not just manage our failure rate, which again, at some point, it doesn't really tell us how to get better. If you have a 0.3 frequency rate, you walk up to an employee and say, we have a 0.3, how can you help us improve this? Well, if they've never had an accident, they'll keep on keeping on. It doesn't necessarily tell us how to get better, and that's why we need measurements of performance and measurements of progress. Also, we have to realize how people enter our culture is not as simple as when they're hired and when they retire. Some people come and go at different levels. So we look at when somebody comes into the organization, whether they're experienced or they're a new individual, how do we indoctrinate them into the culture? What are our onboarding practices? Even prior to onboarding practices, are you hiring the right people with the right mindset? A lot of companies have already looked at this from a contractor perspective because they realize if they've established what they believe to be a really good culture, it could be compromised by a contractor that they may work with that doesn't have the same attitudes, beliefs, and observable behaviors and everything. Well, the same thing could happen if you hire somebody that's very influential, very well liked, but has a different attitude towards safety. Might that compromise your culture? So how are we onboarding people, but also how are we identifying the right type of people with the right mindsets that are going to help us in our direction here? We try to do a lot of things to get people to participate in our culture as we mature it. But there's a lot of thinking around this on how do we actually enhance our culture, and how are people entering and how are they exiting our culture. And that's something I would encourage you to look at is and study this map here and really look at your own organization and see how some of these different practices are being managed. But one of the models that I really wanted to get to here that kind of shapes how cultures form and how they norm, I put this together after working with an organization. And I give this organization a lot of credit because after a global perception survey, they have close to 100 locations. We went with the executive team to this one location, not because they were the poorest. We went there because they were the best. And the reason I give them a lot of credit, a lot of companies tend to respond to perception surveys by focusing on the exception and addressing the things that are out of place and don't make sense, the whole management by exception, what's wrong thing. Whereas this organization focused on the site that had the best leading, lagging, cultural indicators, and everything else to try to figure out what they were doing so well. And one of the things we wanted to look at during the perception survey, this site rated the highest around the category of leadership, perceived leadership support for safety excellence and quality excellence, etc. And I ended up meeting the hero of a story that a third of the population I interviewed could tell me about. Now, let me back up before I tell you the story. People have perceptions within your culture, perceptions and beliefs about leadership support, as I've already mentioned. It's a good idea to stop the job for a safety concern because my boss is going to support that inquiry, that decision. Or it's a bad idea. Or it's a good idea to volunteer for an organization, or it's a bad idea because the bosses view volunteers as voluntolds and they don't really get anything done, etc. There's a lot of beliefs that exist around safety. And part of the visioneering on what you want your culture to look like is to establish up front what are the key beliefs that are going to influence a lot of the decisions and what people do. But people have existing perceptions. When people join your site or your company, they are to some degree normed and influenced by the existing perceptions that are there. Perceptions, as we know, influence attitudes. Now, a lot of people talk about wanting great attitudes. The challenge is attitudes are very difficult to measure without some of the other components. You cannot see an attitude. Some people will say, oh, I've seen lazy. Well, you see behaviors that indicate laziness, but attitude's something more of an internal thing. But nevertheless, perceptions do influence attitudes, and they're also going to influence over time the cultural values, but also sometimes the individual values. But when somebody has a perception about something, like it's a good idea to stop the job for a safety concern or report a near miss or volunteer, they're going to make a different decision when that opportunity presents itself than if they don't have that perception. Now, when somebody makes the decision to say stop the job for safety concern, they have an expectation of what will occur when they behave in a certain way, stopping the job or not stopping the job. But the experiences they have shape the stories that either confirm or conflict with the perceptions that exist in the organization. The challenge here, and often in safety as well, the more negative the experiences are, the louder the stories are in the organization. Now, the reason for this is if somebody makes a decision to do something, they have an expectation of what will occur. All disappointment is based on a set level of expectations. If you've ever been disappointed, it's because your expectations aren't being met. But if you decide to stop the job for a safety concern and you have a good experience, well, why are you going to go tell many people because it met your expectations? Why would you brag about it? Now, if you have a great experience, you may tell a couple of people because it exceeded your expectations. But goodness, if you have a bad experience, you're going to tell a lot of people because it didn't meet your expectations, and you're upset, you're ticked off. That's typically what tends to occur within organizational cultures. And if you think about these different things here, several of them are actually measurable. Now, in measurement, little side note here, we often have to remember that an imprecise measurement of the right thing can be better than a precise of the wrong thing. You can measure perceptions. A lot of companies will try to sell you their packaged perception surveys. I encourage you to develop your own perception surveys, and there's a lot of literature available to help an organization do that. Because, again, that starts with what are you trying to create, what are the beliefs you're trying to create, rather than what other people perceive as great. But you can measure perceptions. You can measure decisions. You can measure decisions during observed practices. You can measure decisions after an incident's occurred. Several ways proactively and reactively to measure decisions. Behaviors. For 40 years, organizations have been measuring behaviors. Behavior-based safety, observation-based safety, all kinds of different practices. To some degree, you can measure experiences, but the best way to measure experiences is through the stories. And again, a lot of these are imprecise. But it all starts with trying to understand in advance what are the perceptions we want to have in place here. Once we understand the perceptions, then we have to start backing up and saying, well, what are the experiences we want people to have if they make the decision to do these things or act in this way? And then it starts with leadership and saying, well, what's the leadership's role? What are their behaviors to ensure employees are having these experiences? Culture change happens best from within, but the leaders create the culture that's there. Employee behaviors, as an example, are typically a byproduct of the culture and the systems and leadership style. Now, that's not about assigning blame on anything, but people tend to behave in a way that is consistent with their systems. Drucker also pointed out that your organizational systems are perfectly designed to give you the results you're currently receiving. So that's why we have to back up and say we have an existing culture. Rather than saying how do we create a culture of safety, we have to first realize we have safety elements within our culture. How do we make them a little bit better? Now, once we understand where we'd like to go and what are the key beliefs and key experiences and key stories we'd like to hear that gives us an imprecise measurement that we're going in the right direction, sometimes we also have to back up and say, well, what are the perceptions that could compromise our ability to move forward? And this is something that I put together after several hundred projects, that when we found organizations that had these key 5 perceptions in place, every single time they presented barriers to further improvement in both performance and culture. Number 1, on the bottom left there, is if people think that initial goal of 0 injuries, 0 incidents, 0 hurt isn't possible, especially if this exists in a leadership level. If you're not going to work very hard at something if your boss doesn't think it's a possibility. If people think that you're already good in safety, we're already good. You know, we've tried some other things. It's not going to. They haven't really improved us much, so we're already pretty good in safety, and there's really nothing else that we need. Also, as I've already alluded to, people think that safety is not their job. Going out and saying safety is everyone's responsibility is a cliche unless you tell people precisely what that responsibility is. What would be observed performance will let you know that they're carrying out their responsibilities. If people think or the organization thinks it's not going to happen to them, either an organizational or individual loss of vulnerability. If people believe that they're already good and zero injuries isn't possible, and I've worked 20 years here, I haven't gotten injured, it's not going to happen to somebody, it's not going to happen to me, it's going to happen to somebody else. Those are the individuals and the organizations that are surprised by incidents out of nowhere. And unfortunately, usually when we experience an incident that's out of the blue like that, usually that's an indicator that we're not measuring the right things. And that last thing there is if the organizational and shared definition of safe or safety is more around the lagging indicators and not getting hurt, you're going to see situations like this. Someone in our firm took this picture after we were training a bunch of internal safety professionals to carry a lot of these change initiatives forward within their own company. We came outside, and this is what we saw. This poor individual had 15 safety professionals coming out. Yes, of course, this individual, too, was stopped and had a conversation, some consequences and everything. But what happened was this was a resident contractor who spends a lot of time at the site. Maintenance is outsourced to this contract firm, and a lot of people didn't ask many questions when he realized he didn't have the right equipment and needed to change some lights. So he borrowed the equipment. He borrowed a forklift, drove that on the back of a flatbed trailer, speared a wooden pallet. That wasn't quite tall enough, so he borrowed a plastic milk crate, which is what he's standing on. And when, obviously, we expressed concern about this decision, he pointed to the gentleman in the far left of the picture that you can barely see and stated, well, that's my spotter. It's quite unfortunate when not only is this situation serious and unfortunate, you think about when we all receive pictures, and I have thousands of pictures like this that I've taken and other people have shared with me. You see something like this, and answer this question for yourself or maybe as a group if you're watching this with people. What's the most likely thing that's going to happen in this situation? The answer is typically nothing. Him and the spotter are going to go home, and the company's going to celebrate another day without an accident. Good job, folks. Keep it up. People know what it takes to get promoted. People know what it takes to get things done in the organization. That's why safety has to play a role in business decisions, not something that's managed as a separate entity. But it is important to be able to get our hands around some of these things if we have some key measurements around safety. And a lot of those measurements, I'm encouraging you to focus more on what you want in safety rather than just what you don't want. And that'll be something that tends to delay or even pause progress and improvement in culture and performance, is when we spend the majority of our time and energy focusing on what we don't want rather than focusing and measuring what we do want. So what we do want when we start looking at performance, in this area we're starting to look at behaviors. And there's a lot of things that influence performance as well, but of course this is only a 90-minute webinar here. But when you look at it, there are 4 types of behaviors in safety. There always have been and always will. I put this model together after I was coaching an organization that was trying to use their behavior-based safety process to cover all aspects of behaviors and safety. And that's where I came up with the term that BBS, behavior-based safety, is a situational tool for one of the 4 types of behaviors in safety. As you can see, there's 2 categories. There are injury and incident prevention behaviors, and there's desirable safety culture behaviors. But if even before getting to number 1, that's where companies need their proactive prioritization process to first identify risk and also reactively look at the incidents and say, where do we have greatest improvement opportunity in addressing the conditions, the systems, or in addressing the behaviors. And all incidents have both a control point to them, but which one's going to give us our biggest return and address the majority of the risk exposure? If it's conditions, obviously you focus on the barriers and the hazards first. If it's behaviors, then you need a prioritization process to focus on which ones do we really need to concentrate most on, the mandatory behaviors or the discretionary ones. If it's discretionary, if you look at your incidents, you look at your risk exposure and observed practices, if the majority of the opportunity lies beyond rules, policies, procedures, it's things above and beyond that, well, the approach isn't a tool of control. It's about influence, and that's what behavioral processes, behavior-based safety as an example, is designed to do, influence. It's not designed to be something to control rules, policies, and procedures. If you look at your injuries, or again, risk exposure, and the majority of the opportunity lies with people following the rules, or your incidents are a result of people deviating from the rules, policies, and procedures. You don't need behavior-based safety. You need to strengthen the capabilities of leaders to hold people accountable for the rules that they need to follow. That's a different approach to this. And, it's like that old statement, and I'm trying not to use too many cliches, but if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, and that's the same thing here. There's a lot more issues that need to be addressed in many different ways, and the tools that you use to get you in pretty good in safety are not always going to be the same tools to get you to excellence in safety performance. Now, on the other side of this, your safety culture, there are mandatory behaviors. And I would encourage a discussion within your organization. What are the mandatory behaviors within our culture? Like some simple ones. You can't harass another person. A positively defined one, everybody needs to show up to the training or participate in the training or be trained, right? If people don't participate or deviate from the things that are mandatory within the culture, they could lose their job potentially. I mean, that's where leadership needs to control the behaviors that are expected within the culture or within safety. But there's other discretionary things. I've already referenced one example, employees getting their own safety magazines at home and reading them and coming in and giving ideas. Now, the more mature your safety culture and your culture in general is, the more things become at least perceived mandatory. I work with organizations that it's expected, not just by management, but also employees, that employees are going to lead safety meetings and search for toolbox topics to lead. And that's something that's just expected. It's something we do around here. Now, again, if your culture is not as mature, that's going to be discretionary. Now, you can't go out and write a rule and discipline people for not doing that. That's something you want to inspire people to do. So what I'm encouraging with this is you have some systems around this. But also, at the end of the day, you need systems to respond to if people are deviating from what you'd like them to do, mandatory or discretionary. In our experience, and again, we're communicating this webinar based on our experience and our research and our practices over the past 20 years, we found that there are 4 primary things that might influence somebody to take a risk or put themselves in risk exposure. And it's important that your systems also respond to these rather than the individual. People perform for reasons. You have to address the reason, not just the person. If one person's encouraged to take a risk, as an example, and multiple people do the same type of work, that means that influence is broader than that individual. If somebody's done it this way because that's the way that they've always done it and they don't see the risk, and we define safe as not getting hurt, well, their perception about the risk may be off. We may need to go back to that perception model, give them different experiences or give them different information to shape their perceptions. You can't force an epiphany. You can't force somebody to believe something different. You may get behavior that's mandatory by forcing it, but you're not going to affect the decisions and the beliefs. Now, maybe it's just habitual. Maybe it's just the way that they've always done it. They recognize the risk, but we've given them a new tool to do it safer, and they've just always been in the habit of doing it a different way. And sometimes there are things that make it difficult or impossible. I've recorded a lot of other webinars and published a lot of stuff on those obstacles and barriers in safety. But something that makes it difficult for somebody to perform the task in a risk-free manner, or impossible, there's no other way, they have to stand here, near suspended loads or whatever the case is to get the job done. That's not an opportunity for training and coaching. That's an opportunity we need to address those barriers and obstacles, because there's nothing from a behavioral perspective we can really do. Somebody has to put themselves at risk. And that's where that evolution question starts to come in when we're trying to improve the culture. It's how do we make the change in thinking from what's accepted practices today to unaccepted practices tomorrow? And that comes, again, with looking at all of this and better understanding the type of culture that we want, and then where are we right now, and what are the things that we could focus on that would give us the biggest return. But again, this comes back to what are the leaders' responsibility. And I'm just sharing some of our models here, but it starts at the top. I just had a conversation today with organizations, and it happens weekly, that they contact us and they want us to do some leadership training for their supervisors and managers. Well, again, their decisions and their behaviors are typically a byproduct of senior and executive managers' decisions and leadership styles. If you just address the manager and supervisor, they could certainly not be sustainable whenever there's changes up top if we're not addressing even executive onboarding practices. In America, I don't remember the statistics exactly, but the last documentation I read about two or 3 years ago said that in America the average tenure of a plant manager was about 3 to 4 years. So we could work on trying to address the supervisor leadership behaviors, and all of that could change the next 3 years when the next leader comes in with their new priorities and things that they want to execute on. And that's why we'll see in a lot of companies that wait-and-see attitude among that lower level of leadership, because they know that they're the ones that are running the place, and new manager is going to come in, but they're only going to be there for a few years. This is something that has to start at the top of the organization. And typically when we coach and advise and work with corporations, it's at that board or that senior executive level, because they're the ones that are making the decisions that are influencing, all the way down what the employee does at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's not about accountability to find fault or place blame. It's more about, are we doing the right things to influence the decisions that people are making when we, the decision makers and enforcers of the rules, aren't around? And that's why it starts at the top in answering those 2 questions. What are the primary responsibilities? Safety RRR is just our terminology for safety roles, responsibilities, and results. But responsibilities need to be behaviorally defined. What would be observable? What are the 2 primary responsibilities for a senior manager to help us with our performance excellence? And that's that whole injury prevention side. What also is their primary responsibility to help us create the culture that we want? What I encourage is a very narrow focus and a very narrow list. A company focused on 5 things is not a focused organization. What are the primary responsibilities on the dual sides of safety excellence? And that's both the performance side and also the cultural side. But we would encourage you, again, once you identify that, then look at and say, what's our starting point? Of the different levels, and there's different hierarchy for every organization, but just the basic ones of executive managers and supervisors, if you could only put them into 2 buckets, which buckets would you put them in, and what percentage? What percentage of your executives or managers, supervisors, inspire and drive change? They're change agents. They challenge status quo thinking. What percentage of them would you put in the category of those who maintain the status quo? They do a good job managing the way that we do things around here. What I always find interesting then is, to whom do these individuals report? I've seen time and time again a great up-and-coming supervisor. It's got some great leadership skills and really a big thinker, some WAG goals and everything, and they end up reporting to somebody who maintains the status quo, and eventually that changes the way the supervisor thinks about things and become more risk-averse and trying to drive for improvement, and sometimes even leave the organization. But once you identify what leadership's role is, then we would encourage you to assess and say, where are you right now within the leaders? Do we have the right individuals in place, and do they have the right competencies? Rather than, like an organization I spoke with today, they wanted leadership training, but to what end? What specifically do we want to focus the leadership training on, and what are our measurements that it's had an impact on performance, not just theirs, but the business results that we need? Also realize within the company, we're going to have a lot of things that are going to that are within the organization. There's also people that we need to leverage as part of this change, and it's helpful to realize where the folks are within the company there. You're going to have 5 types of people in organizational change, and it's important to put them into the list so you know how you can best leverage them and how they can best help you with this improvement objective. Again, realizing culture change happens best from within. You have people that are the pioneers, the change agents, the mavens, if you will. They like new change. They like to be involved in new change. In a lot of organizations, those people are always involved in continuous improvement efforts. So maybe you need to look for other people that, if given a development opportunity, could do a good job. We call those people the yes people. Now, all that means is if you walk up to somebody and say, hey, we have this new thing that we're trying to do, and we'd really like to get some input from some folks in this area, and we think you do a good job. Would you want to help us out? And they say, yeah, sure, no problem. Now, crowd followers, typically the bell curve, lands here. We have a lot of crowd followers in the organization. They're not necessarily skeptics, but they just want to see other people get involved first, and once other people get involved, they tend to jump on the bandwagon. Now, the skeptics are typically more of an engineering mindset. They trust data and have a very low opinion of opinions, but that's good because they're thinking, and all that means is that they need to be proven with data rather than just opinions that this could be something that's worthwhile, and often they could become key advocates for you. But also in a lot of organizations, there are people that are commonly referred to as cave people, the citizens against virtually everything. And not everybody's a cave person across the board. They just maybe a cave person in quality, or a cave person in safety, or a cave person in new programs in general. But it's important to know where these individuals are because, again, I'll restate it for the third time, culture change happens best from within. So who are the individuals within your culture that you could get involved and they could start bringing the change? Because once you start using these people to help us identify, are we doing the right things with the leadership? Are we giving people the better experiences? This is the point, and I'm oversimplifying it here, of course, but this is the point where we start getting influential people within the culture to start looking for the good experiences and start telling the stories. That story that I told you with that I apologize that I missed, the perceptions, the attitudes, values, decisions. When I was interviewing a group of individuals that I already referenced could tell me this guy's story, he was working in a machine shop, and he sees three people walking in his machine shop, and the only one wearing required eye protection was a new engineer that had just hired on. The other two were relatively new or were visitors, based on security protocols. You could see that they were visitors. So he stopped what he was doing, and he approached these visitors and said, safety is really important around here. I'd like to get you some safety glasses because they're required here. He walked them over to the safety glasses bin, got them some safety goggles, handed it to them, wished them a good visit. He didn't think much of it until the assistant plant manager, Jennifer, who was standing nearby, saw this, and she walked up to him and said almost verbatim, shaking his hand, "Thank you very much for what I saw you do. Safety is really important to me, and I'm glad it was important to you to help our visitors be safe. Thank you for that." His experience gave him a different story to tell when people would say things like, production's king around here, all they care is about the numbers, etc. He would say, no, let me tell you what happened with Jennifer over here. Now, those are the type of stories that you want to be looking for and starting to manage those stories. But you need to have the key influential people within the culture that are looking for these stories because it needs to be their stories, not just yours. Now, I've already referenced accountability a couple times, and accountability and safety, one of my recent articles from the magazines I write for, wrote about this, but accountability often becomes a dirty word in safety based on the way that accountability is used. Most organizations, not all, but most organizations, when they look at accountability, tend to say things like, we didn't get the results that we wanted, who needs to be held accountable? Well, like safety, there's two sides to accountability. There's a proactive side and there's a reactive side. The proactive side is holding people accountable for their behaviors or holding people accountable for their performance. The reactive side is holding people accountable for the results. Now, both need to have, positive and sometimes even negative. If we get great results, I want the people that I work with and that work for me to know why we got those great results. Because they were doing those things consistently, that's why we got the great results. Good job, keep it up. Or sometimes even we got the great results, but you weren't doing the things that we need to do. What can we do differently? Or we didn't get the results that we needed, and you weren't doing the weekly, daily toolbox, whatever it is. We need to do something different about this. But true accountability is ensuring people are doing what's necessary to get our results before checking to see if we got the results or not. I'm trying to make it simple to see the difference here, because if you want somebody to do a weekly toolbox topic, well, if it's the end of the first week or halfway through the month, how are you doing to hold them accountable for the weekly toolbox topic that you need them to do, rather than checking at the end of the month or the end of the year to say, how did we do? If somebody's doing, great toolbox topics and it's very participative, you need to hold them accountable for that. Let them know that's exactly what's expected of them, or if they're not doing these things. But we need to manage accountability just like we manage safety. We need to have a proactive side just as we need to have a reactive side to it. But when we give feedback, we need to make sure that we're focusing, just like that lady that I told you the story about, that we're giving feedback around what we want and where measurements are more aligned with what we want, giving us that sense that we're doing better rather than we're just failing less. And that's important because it's been proven in research that based on an article in Harvard Business Review and a book that was later written called The Progress Principle, that one of the most effective motivators in a work setting is visible progress towards a goal. Now, if the goal in safety is just failing less and less injuries, so is our visible progress the absence of injuries, or is it we're starting to see more of what we want take place when we're walking the halls and when we're visiting the locations? When I was working with a military base, I pulled over in North Carolina and I took this picture. Now, I've been to all 50 states in America, and most of them say things like click it or ticket, $240 fines, seatbelt enforcement zone. Over here, it turned out that they had an anonymous observation process, again, an imprecise measurement, where people sitting at intersections with clickers. Click wearing the seatbelt, click not wearing the seatbelt. And they posted the scores here. Last month, 89% of people were wearing their seatbelt. The record was 95%. This is a, hey, this is how we're doing and this is how we can get better. Now, they could have posted 11% of you knuckleheads weren't wearing your seatbelt. We know who you are. But instead, this is more of a group score we're getting better rather than a group score we're failing less. Think about the type of feedback that we're providing people. Are we giving them a sense of great job, keep it up, or are we giving them a sense of, well, we failed less, so keep doing whatever you're doing and avoiding the things that you're avoiding? Now, when we start looking at marketing safety, I believe there's 4 primary things that some of our best performing clients do well. Number 1, they brand safety. There's a lot of emotional responses to brand. A very simple example here in America is Chevy versus Ford. I know a lot of people that are passionate about Chevy or they're passionate about Ford and a lot of other motor vehicle companies. I don't mean to exclude anyone or leave anyone out. But there are brands like Starbucks, like Coca-Cola, like Pepsi, like Gatorade that have a very strong sense of identity, and they tend to draw certain types of people. Well, what's your brand in safety? When people think about safety, what do they think about? What excites them about it? What's the mental imagery in safety? Are your measurements in safety? Do they support your brand? Think about something as simple as how many people in your organization are super excited about your safety measurements. So how does that reflect the brand of safety? Is it something somebody wants to draw towards or push away from? When you walk into supermarkets, people want certain spaces within the aisles or on the end caps just because they've positioned their brand well to have that sense of imagery. So what's your brand in safety? What do people really think of? How do you position that in communication and in other facets of operational performance and communication and feedback? How do we capture the voice of the customer? How do we make sure that what we're doing is providing value? A lot of companies we work with, that's the key thing that they look at. And sometimes, again, the customer doesn't know exactly what they need or what they want, and that's why we need that internal expertise to ensure that we're going in the desired direction. But we're about to roll out a new near-miss program, and because there's a lot of features of this that would make us more successful, we've decided that it's going to be 15 pages and needs to be filled out in triplicate. Well, an obvious example there, what's the voice of the customer? A lot of you are on the lean journey, Gimbo, right, going out into the workforce and involving the employees in the problem solving. We have to capture their voice to make sure that safety is focusing on value add rather than just reducing cost. And this is a big problem that tends to placate a lot of safety initiatives, as safety tends to be put in that category as a cost center rather than a value contributor. You know, write out a list of what are all the costs in safety that you're trying to manage, and what are all the things that if you could focus on and become excellent in just safety alone would contribute to the business performance. A lot of companies in many industries, the CEOs of these companies that are both, you know, looking at their own internal leadership, but also their clients, that are looking at this and starting to ask that question. I've seen this in a lot of conferences that I speak at. The CEO will ask that question or more or less make that statement that if you're not great in something as important as safety, what else aren't you good at? A lot of the great leaders are realizing that safety indicators and the performance outcomes indicate the capabilities of leaders to manage important tasks and important objectives. So how are we really capturing the voice of the customer? And employees, contractors, leaders are our customers in safety. They're not the problem. So what are we doing that adds value to them and helps the business succeed? Then how do we reinforce the buying decision? A lot of great marketing firms, and by the way, most larger companies have their own marketing firms. Some of our other best performing companies leverage their own internal marketing expertise to answer some of these questions because they live and breathe this stuff. But how do we reinforce the decision to buy in? If we've typically had voluntold in safety, we go out and say, hey, you're a volunteer to go for this new program here. But if we finally get people to volunteer, how do we reinforce that decision that it was a good idea? Or when they return back to their work, is the opposite reinforced. They say, well, where you get back to work, and extra pressure is added on them, thus demonstrating it's not a good idea to buy into or volunteer for something. But a lot of the great marketing companies want to make you feel good about your purchase after your purchase, so when given the opportunity to make that buying decision, you'll do so again. The same thinking here with safety. If somebody supports our change improvement initiatives, how do we make them feel as though that was a good idea to support that, so when given the opportunity and decision, they'll make that same decision again? But one thing I wanted to share with you here, and hopefully you'll purchase from ASSE a copy of this, or you'll get access to this. We want you to look at your own organizational culture, whether it's you use the Bradley curve or a lot of other measurements of cultural maturity. This is one that we've used extensively in companies to start the identity of where are we right now and what are the most important things we need to focus on. We have a chapter in our book that talks about this as well. But what we'll do in a facilitated discussion, and this is something you can do internally, is look at each one of these elements, and based on our experience with about 2,000 projects that our company's led over 20 years, we found that when these elements are very strong in place, we always find that correlation of better performance and better cultures. So what I would encourage you to do for a model just like this is, and perhaps even, develop your own elements here, but we found consistently that when there's a passion for safety excellence at all levels of the organization, you're going to have a better culture. And what I mean by that is not just passion for not getting injured. Everybody's passionate about not getting injured, but is there passion at all levels for safety excellence? And safety excellence is more the above and beyond stuff. Focus. There's a very clear focus, and we're focused on the right things. Remember the acronym, forming one common understanding of safety. We have alignment and consistency within our focus, and based on data, we are confident that we're focused proactively on the right things to both prevent injuries and incidents, but also to evolve our culture. And everybody knows what that focus is. You can measure that by walking up to an employee and ask them, and they can respond back to you. Several other ways to measure that, but that's not the point of this one. Expectations. I work with a lot of great executives, and they say, of course the expectations are clear. We want an incident rate of fill in the blank. What we're talking about here is the expectations of performance. People know what performance is expected of them in alignment with the organizational focus. Proactive accountability. We are proactively, not just reactively, think about that model I shared, we're proactively holding people accountable for the performance that we expected of them, not just the results. But as I'm going through this, think in your own mind, on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you on each one of these elements? We do this in a lot of group exercises or one-on-one with people. A lot of companies will use this just as a benchmark to assess themselves against 6 months or a year from now once they've prioritized the initiatives to see have we made a difference in these categories. Reinforcement. The right things are being reinforced in the absence of the enforcers. And a lot of that has to do with the stories and the experiences that people have. We are maintaining a healthy sense of vulnerability. I'm not talking about scaring people into safety that could happen to them, but making sure people have a healthy appreciation for the risk. So a lot of that has to do with risk identification and mitigation, that they understand that there's risk everywhere and know the different types of risks. And that also goes back to reshaping the terminology around what safe means, and it doesn't just mean not having any accidents, because that will influence vulnerability or invulnerability. Communication is very clear, consistent, strong, free-flowing, lateral, up and down in the organization. I love what George Bernard Shaw, the Irish playwright, once said. He said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. Communication is not about putting some information in front of somebody. I'm sure you've probably seen this in your career if you've been around long enough, putting a piece of paper in front of somebody and saying, here, sign that you read it. That's what I call a receipt of communication. Communication is about knowledge transfer, and they both have to have a sender and receiver turned on and tuned in, and validation the message was received. Communication is hard to get right. Consider what Cotter found in his number one reason people resist change is they don't understand the change. So communication is not just a safety opportunity, it's a cultural opportunity. Measurement. Consider what measurement is supposed to do. It's supposed to prompt, direct, align, motivate behavior in an organization. Are we measuring what we want, measuring what we don't want? Are we separating when necessary evaluation from measurement? a lot of the things that we tend to measure in safety, again, send that context of failing less rather than how do we continuously get better. And trust. I think that trust is the bonding agent that makes all of this effective. If people don't trust what we're measuring, if people don't trust what we're focusing on, if people don't trust what we're reinforcing or what we're communicating, we're not going to make an impact in any of these areas. A question just came about that I'll try to answer briefly, and perhaps maybe if we have time at the end I can elaborate on. What's the most single important discovery in changing safety cultures in the last 5 years? From a research perspective, I'd have to get back to you on that. I'd have to go back to all of my notes. From my experience, I think the most important discovery that organizations have internally found is that it's the business leaders that are responsible for the safety culture, not the safety departments. And again, that's more in companies that are on a continuous improvement journey and realize that safety, again, is just a facet of operational excellence, not a standalone objective that needs to be managed. But I can't state that that's based on profound research because I'd have to go back to it. That's just based on my experience working with some of the better organizations. And also I'm starting to see a lot more conversation, dialogue on all the LinkedIn groups and in articles and safety conferences that it's the leaders that are responsible for the safety culture, not the safety department. And I think that goes back to what I said earlier, that, you know, a value will never become a value when it's delegated to a person or a business unit within an organization. It's just like trust and integrity. We don't have a trust manager and an integrity manager. Now, I'm not advocating getting rid of safety managers by any means because they need to manage some of the program inputs and the activities and stuff like that and become advisors to the organization. But it should be more of an advisory role than a process owner. So if I haven't answered that, please put in another question. I can try to address that at the end. So another way I wanted to try to visually display this is if you look at your safety excellence vision and you try to identify your injury and your accident prevention goals or your cultural goals, you have to have a good prioritization process that helps you identify what initiatives are going to help us accomplish our objectives to meet our goals. And unfortunately, I see a lot of companies that tend to flip this, and they first identify their initiatives, and then they try to validate it by developing some measurements that will improve the certain objectives and goals. We first need to start off with, well, what does excellence look like beyond just the 0 injuries? So excellence looks like X, Y, and Z. These are the things that we would see when we visit an organization, both in the reporting but also in the observed practices that lets us know why we have great cultures and why we have great incident rates. So we look at our incidents and our risk exposure, multiple data points, and say, what are the most important things we need to focus on? What are our goals here? Okay, our objective is we need to address this type of incident or this cause of incident, so what are the initiatives we need to prioritize? But the same process, we're strongly encouraging corporations that aren't doing it this way to at least consider the same thinking on cultural enhancement. What's the cultural enhancement goal? What is the culture going to look like? And a lot of companies have very strong corporate cultures, and that's why we look at how do we enhance or leverage the corporate culture thinking rather than a standalone process methodology. If we have to reinvent new wheels, that's not going to be as effective as if there's already a good forecasting and planning and strategy mapping process in place for other areas of business. All we're suggesting is that we use the tools that are already demonstrating good improvement in one area of the business to start leveraging them in other areas of the business as well. What are the top 5 beliefs or top 2 beliefs, principles that we could have exist? So what are then the objectives that we want to focus on that would help us best achieve our values? And then following this, of course, is how do we measure progress rather than activities? We can measure that we're doing a bunch of toolbox topics, but what's the purpose of the toolbox topic? Is it to create certain beliefs? Is it to prompt certain behaviors? So how well aligned in our measurement systems to validate the toolbox topics are accomplishing those objectives? And this is where, similar to like a plan, do, check, act type of example, we encourage just another way to look at this of film. Focus, influence, listen, and measure. I saw another article, or another question that came in. How do we can I provide a few examples? Companies reinforce the stories to create the winning attitude. Well, what stories? I would actually respond with, what stories would give you a sense of winning? What are the things that let people know that we're accomplishing things? Like in safety, are you measuring your cycle time on safety work order requests completed versus production work order requests? How do you then communicate those stories to the population that here's where we're at, these are all the things that we've accomplished? Are you measuring observed practices that say, we were 95% safe rather than we just had 0 injuries this month? But I would encourage you, because the answer is going to be a little bit different corporation by corporation. What does winning look like in safety beyond just having no injuries? Well, we feel as though we'd be winning in safety if we had more people that were volunteering. So how many people volunteered for the past few initiatives? We feel as though we'd be winning in safety if we had more people reporting anonymously near misses, or we were in our observed practices. So I would encourage that you first start with, well, what does safety excellence look like from a cultural perspective, and then start looking at, well, what are some of the stories that we would hear from people that let us know that we're winning? But go back to this model here. What's the focus need to be? What do we need to focus on above all others? And that's that transformational thinking. What one thing would have the biggest impact in safety? Now, how do we go out and influence people? There are tools of control, and we have to deploy those tools of control, because if we don't, we can receive just as many violations from the regulatory agencies for not enforcing the rules, as some of the other issues that we have out there. So how do we go out and influence people? Now, how do we listen? Doug Larson once said that wisdom is the result of a lifetime of listening when you would have preferred to have talked. So how do we listen to people? And that's, again, that capturing the voice of the customer. And how do we measure that we're making progress here rather than that we're just focusing on activities? But, again, I would bring this back to focus on and better understanding what's your starting point. Do you have the right type of thinking in the business leaders? Are they well aligned? And what percentage of them inspire and drive change in other areas of safety? Don't just think about in safety. Do we have change agents and inspirers of change in other areas of operational performance? Or do we have people that are maintaining the status quo? When we're trying to address performance, there's 4 things that tend to influence performance. Number 1, if somebody's unable to do it. So if we need somebody to be a change agent and they don't have the skills, well, yeah, we need to provide them competencies. We need to provide them training. We need to enable them. Now, the next question is are they unwilling to do it? That's a whole other issue here. If we need somebody to be a certain type of leader for additional performance, then and they're unwilling to do it, then that's a more difficult question. And sometimes deselection is the only tool that you have. If somebody's standing in the way of progress that's necessary, like safety improvement. But the third reason that tends to, or element that tends to influence trying to improve leadership skills and performance in general is accountability. And that goes back to what I said earlier. Are we really holding people accountable? And the last thing there is culture, when your culture tends to work against you. And this is what's interesting. There's been a healthy debate over the past decade or so around, do cultures resist change or not? And in our experiences, they don't necessarily resist change. They resist forced change. When you and the force go away, so does the change. So cultures are always changing when they want to. They don't necessarily resist the change, they resist the force. And that's why it's so important that you have an approach that manages the cultural side of this. And once you put that approach in place, there needs to be healthy indicators that provide a correlation on the things that you're doing, because if we're going out and providing training, as an example, the things that we're doing to manage safety improvement, and it doesn't change the perceptions within the culture or the common practice within the performance, well, how effective was the training? I wouldn't call that very effective if it's not changing beliefs and if it's not changing or perpetuating the desirable behaviors. You go back to Kirkpatrick's model from the 1950s. He said there's 4 layers of effectiveness when measuring training effectiveness. I apologize. Number 1 is, did people like the training? Did they appreciate it? Well, sometimes training is difficult. Sometimes it's not a pleasant message. But, smiley sheets, evaluations, did they like the training? Number 2 is, did it change what they know, knowledge? Well, that's what a lot of pre- and post tests are for. What do people know coming into it? What did they know afterwards? The third layer is, did it change or perpetuate behaviors? So that's why all training has to have some sort of behavioral objective. If given this training, what do you want them to continue or to do differently? The fourth thing is how does that contribute to the business results? And in safety, we all know, and I'm not trying to belabor the point here, but we need to make sure that we have better measurements of not just the results, but also a correlation between the things that we're doing and how does that influence. This is just an example of a balanced scorecard that several of our clients use. Another example here is what's referred to as the transformational safety scorecard. Over in the left category, when we first started putting this together, everybody realizes this, that leaders are always focusing on that one lagging indicator, and sometimes more than one lagging indicator, but we needed to provide a single leading indicator that locations could better manage their safety activities. And this is just an example here. What's the safety leadership score? What are the things that we're doing to lead safety? And there's a lot that goes into that. I've published articles on this model. What's the cultural maturity score? Perception surveys. Use the chemistry of safety culture excellence. A lot of other models that you can use to measure your own maturity on where you want to be in your strategy. And then what's the common practice? And what several clients have done is taken these three numbers, divided by 3, and provided a single leading indicator. Again, I'm oversimplifying this because it's a brief webinar, but we have published a lot in our book and extensively in articles as well that would provide a little bit more insight. That a lot of those articles are freely available. But at the end of the day, when I joked around with Mike Tyson's comment, but also what the military taught me, if you want to effectively execute, there are 4 things that need to be in place. And executing against the strategy is what I'm referring to improve your culture. You have to have boundaryless information flow. We can't be censoring information up and down in the organization. Some leaders will deploy what's called skip level meetings, where they'll skip a level in the organization and meet with the reports of their direct reports, just as a way to validate is the information free-flowing. Are we proactively holding people accountable for the performance that we need of them to help us in the execution of the strategy? Are we maintaining and providing visible progress? It's hard to win a game if we can't see the score, and the score can't just be we haven't failed yet. So what are the things that give us a sense of, again, that winning, that we're getting better? So what does getting better look like? What are the key things that you would see taking place, that you would hear in conversations that let you know that we have significantly improved safety? Now we start prioritizing our initiatives to ensure we focus on the right things. And then the difficult one of ensuring people have the right decision rights. They know what decisions they can make. We want an autonomous workforce, but very few organizations allow people to go in any direction they want. There needs to be a little bit of boundaries there, but we do want people to have the autonomy to make certain decisions. So what decisions can they make? There's a lot to developing a strategy and to improve your culture. We tried to outline in the book many different practices and some of the different things with the hope of organizations realizing the hard work to improving culture has to be led from within the organization. It can't be something that a program is purchased off the shelf. If you have to make royalty payments to a program, that will tend to compromise your ability to sustain it. These initiatives, corporate identity, culture, all of that has to be measured and managed by the business leaders, and the safety professionals need to evolve past just a doing role in safety to being more thought leaders in safety within their company. And that's how we can start to delegate some of these responsibilities away from the safety department, but making it integral to business decisions. Because safety doesn't have to be a separate thing. I know it's a cliche, but it has to be the way that we do things. So we wanted to provide a roadmap and kind of a framework, not as a step-by-step follow this 1, 2, 3, because every organizational culture is going to be a little bit different, a little bit more mature. We're trying to get to the point where we have this great performance and this great culture, but most importantly, when we get there, we want to make sure that we have confidence in forecasting of why we got there and how well we believe, based on our measurements of progress and our strategy, that we're going to do the following year. There's a lot of information we put out there in the public domain. Please use anything that we provide freely available. I've produced a weekly podcast for a little over 5 years now at Safety Culture Excellence. As they're released, they're all freely available. We put a lot of information out there because we want to challenge the global thinking around what safety excellence is. And we don't believe we have all the answers, but we do believe that if collectively we can all share these ideas and we can start trying different things and different practices in safety, that we can make it a better place to live. So if you'd like to reach out to us, I'm about to turn it over for any questions. But if you'd like to reach out to us, there's several different ways you can contact with us. If you're watching this as a recorded webinar prior to the ASSE 2013 in Vegas, please feel free to stop by our booth and say hello to somebody from our firm. Our booth number is 1546. Terry Mathis is speaking on the book, Steps to Safety Culture Excellence, on Wednesday, and I'm speaking on Thursday titled Zero Incident Goals, Create Risk-Taking Cultures, Learn to Measure What Matter. There's a lot of different stuff that's out there, but to be sensitive to the time, I want to turn it back over to the moderator here. Jill?
Thanks, Shawn, for such a great presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, we do have a couple minutes for questions. If you want to ask a question, simply type it into the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen and then click on the send button. We have a question here for you, Shawn. Could you provide any advice for a safety committee to lead up and influence management involvement?
Well, that's a bit of a difficult question to answer. It depends on what that safety committee's role is. Is that role to execute programs? Is it to you suggested the question here to influence and lead up. Well, perhaps it's starting to assess and get a better understanding and involve employees in the committee. I would first wonder if the safety committee is that employee-led, or is there any leadership role in that safety committee? If we're trying to influence up, I think it's about providing information and providing a different way of thinking about things, providing that voice of the customer. But the reason I said it's a difficult question because it also sometimes can be difficult on who's on that safety committee. If the management views them as people who showed up for the free donuts and coffee, if that's what's provided, then they may not be as influential. A lot of the safety committees that I've worked with over the years are actually quite successful. The problem is they're the only ones that know about their successes. So what's the success perception by leadership of the safety committee? Alan Weiss is famous for saying, if you don't blow your own horn, there's no music. It's not polite to brag, but sometimes committees do need to share with leaders their successes so they view them as a winning team rather than just some people to get together. But I would first look at what's the role of that safety committee, who's on the safety committee, and the best way to influence up is to provide different data and different sets of data. So the different data that you could provide is have safety committee do their own perception survey, do their own focus group interviews. That's one way that you can also look at providing or having the safety committee. And again, I don't know how they're structured and what they're focused on, but a lot of safety committees will analyze their own data and tease out some of the conclusions on what the focus needs to be. It depends on the leadership team. If they're very data-oriented, then we need to provide them data. But most importantly, I would get the leaders out there in the field so the safety committee can lead the exercise of helping the leaders talk to the employees that are on the floor and get a better understanding. Sometimes that's a better way than just having the committee present to the leadership team.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that answer. I think that's all the questions we do have for you today. Any final closing remarks?
Well, there was one thing that I came in here that I saw that I didn't get a chance to address, and I'll try to. Crystal balling in the future is a very dangerous thing, and I'm not much of a gambler. I look forward to being at Vegas in a couple of weeks, but I'll probably spend more time on the shows and some of the other things rather than gambling. But I will take a gamble and answer the question that's presented by David on, in my estimation, what will be the most important discovery in the next 5 years to advancing safety culture. I think that goes back to better managing safety with a better strategy. There's a tremendous amount of tools, of human performance initiatives, a lot of thinking, but what we need is we need the business leaders and we need that strategic thinking to be able to pull all the different things together to ensure that we're focusing on what's going to be value add. And I think a strategy that also focuses on recognizing the value of the things that we do in safety is going to be one of the most significant advancement opportunities rather than just positioning safety as the controllers and the mitigators of operational cost. I think if we can get people excited about safety and the different things and the different value that's provided, we're going to create that sense of, that we're winning and safety is a part of that rather than safety is something we have to manage while we're trying to perform a better business. Another thing that Drucker really pointed out well is that for-profit organizations can learn a lot from not-for-profit organizations because you can't fire your volunteer workforce. If people are showing up because they're excited about something, if they see the purpose of what the organization is doing and they have that sense of identity and belongingness and significance and authenticity of the leaders and community and everything, we're going to get a lot more out of people, and we're going to really be able to tap into that discretionary effort. But I think really tapping into discretionary effort without a strategy to do so and without measurements of progress that lets us know we're getting closer to that rather than just failing less, I think that we're going to spend a lot of time and energy and not produce the ROI that's necessary. So I think crystal ball and looking in the future, it's taking all the different programs and all the different great ideas that are out there and putting them into a strategy that we feel confident that we can execute and really align all the resources and focus on the most important thing and keep the most important thing the most important thing. Thank you so much for your time today.
And with that, we must conclude this virtual classroom session. Everyone, if you take a look at the links box on the left-hand side of the screen, you will see the seminar evaluation. As a reminder, you'll need to complete the survey in order to receive CEUs for this event. Your comments and suggestions are very important to us, and they help us to provide you with this kind of quality programming. A special thank you once again to Shawn Galloway for presenting this informative webcast. Any questions that we didn't get to answer today, we will follow up with you after the program. Today's program is copyright 2013 by the American Society of Safety Engineers with all rights reserved. This concludes today's program. Thank you. You may now disconnect.